Well, good day. Thank you for joining us as we do these series of national town halls and webinars. One of the great opportunities we have is periodically do a fireside conversation with leading experts. And I'm really pumped to have the opportunity to visit with Dr. David Alexander, good friend, confidant, advisor, mentor. Uh, he'll have a chance to give a lot more of his background, and we'll jump into a conversation about his new book called Disaster Nation. David is probably somebody who's got some very interesting perspectives and insight from the different roles and relationships he's had, not just as an academic, but in other roles and responsibilities. But David, let me first kind of set the tone for where things are. And you know better than anybody that these articles, this is just a snapshot, David, of, you know, 1 week in this country of all the articles that show up covering every type of disaster, whether it's the wildfires in LA to different types of, flood, hail, tornadoes. But the issue here, I think both of us and those who are listening in recognize, is the cascading impacts for what the nation is having to manage, which is a significant financial, economic, fiscal, and societal impact from over $4.4 trillion of disasters. And this is not good. This is just a repetitive cycle of events, losses that are now impacting a whole set of circumstances for individuals, in their pocketbook, or what we're beginning to define as, tabletop kitchen activities and challenges. Um, we know that these current situations that have emerged are also challenging how the nation responds to not just the large events, but the cascading consequences. So at any point in this country, and David, you see this data literally on your screen on a daily basis as well. We've got a fire someplace. We've got some of event in every part of the country. It's not just coastal. It's not just the mountain. It literally every place in this country. This is an example of how the Department of Energy has been tracking the consequences of the different events causing power losses, uh, significant infrastructure impacts. So we know that this is not a, periodic. This is now just a persistent current snapshot of what happens in this country on a day in and day out basis. And David, as you and I have talked about, there's just a lot of information and data out there that really has signaled that if you take a look at a historic, current, but most importantly, forecasted perspective on where these losses are occurring. So, here's the different types of disasters and peril of the total losses, that occur. Obviously, one of the challenges is uninsured losses, which is exactly the challenge in Los Angeles. Los Angeles rebuild is about $200 billion estimate. Of only 20 billion of that will be in some form covered by insurance. We know that, where this is occurring for residential, commercial, different types of assets and cost. We know that it's occurring not just at the federal level, David, of course, but at the state and local levels, especially in municipalities that are directly picking up cost that may have not been anticipated in their budgets. The other part to it is David and I, you have covered this in your book. You'll cover it in what we talk about in a few minutes. But the reality is that if you look at the next 5 years, we don't know what this graph is going to look like now. There's a lot of uncertainty that you'll share with us and some solutions, most importantly, rather than just pointing out, okay, we've got these problems. The reality is that there are people such as you and others who have really identified very specific ways to get us out of the situation. This is one of those challenges, right, David, that you've covered in the book is this, conundrum that we have all these different sources of federal funding. We have all of these different mechanisms for distributing that funding and for bringing programs, you know, to state and local communities. But the problem is that once we start looking at the sources of federal funding, how it goes to the states and down to local communities, all the way to how congressional committees, state legislatures handle all of these, mechanisms, the eligibility, the rules and requirements. David, that's the reason why I think your book is so important and the work that you and others are doing is this has really become a Gordian knot. This really has become something that you just can't fix it anymore. You really have to look at a whole new approach, or what our board and leadership have referred to as putting a sword to it. So, David, I wanted to kind of put that in context for what we've been working on and why this book is so critical for the disaster nation. It's pretty blunt. It's pretty right in your face that we are a country that is living with persistent amount of disasters, whatever the causes, whatever the circumstances. We are a nation that now must make a choice about how we handle risk and resilience from a perspective of, is there a new model for resilience, meaning pre-disaster response, recovery, rebuild? So with that, David, welcome, welcome, welcome. I look forward to this conversation, but hopefully that sets a little bit of the stage for this.
Oh, most definitely, Richard. I think that was a great entry point. I think, Gordian Knight is a terrific analogy. I think it starts to cut straight to the bone around how do we break through this labyrinth of complexity that I articulate in the book, and I think are important points to understanding.
David, before we get into some of those, pieces of how to look at where the knot is and then what do we need to do next, give a little bit more of your background for those who may not know you as well as I do.
Yeah, no, I'm sure a lot of folks are probably wondering why did this guy write this book and who is he and what makes him an expert. I will start this out by just, making it clear that today's conversation, I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, nor on behalf of the administration. While I do have a role in the federal government, I produced this book independently as part of my just individual interest and research efforts, particularly with my role at Delta State University as an adjunct instructor. So just wanted to put that out front and center. What makes me an expert or at least knowledgeable in this area is that, I've really started my journey back in the 90s. So a few years after the Stafford Act was passed in 1989, I went to school. Suffered through Hurricane Hugo, and that piqued my interest in disasters and emergencies. And throughout that span and that journey, I've had a mix of experience, both in the academic sector as well as at multiple levels of government. So engaging with local governments, spending nearly 10 years in state government in South Carolina, as well as complementing that with a different set of experiences and roles in the federal government.
David,
Uh,
what's your PhD in? I should know that, but what's your PhD in?
yeah, my PhD is actually in geospatial information science and Earth systems, which shows the interdisciplinary nature of some
Right.
of the challenges and problems we face and how we're trying to stretch the science community.
Well, and I think let me leverage that a little bit. All right. All that experience of both, your academic training, your, state, federal training, it is, and I want to kind of start off on part of this. All right. Um, it's the data, it's the empirical information, it's the way to collect that information and disseminate that information that's been part of the core of your work. Am I saying that correctly?
No, I think absolutely. I mean, if you get back to, I think why I wrote this book and what makes it, I think a contribution to the discourse is that it really does pull, on both sides of that journey, both in pulling on my research and analytical, expertise, as well as stitching that with my real world experience and work in the field. Um,
All right. So now you wake up one day and you say, I've got nothing better to do in all of my day duties in my personal life but to write a book, which is never easy. Every person that has told me is it's a labor of love that in one hand they're so pumped to get it started and then get into it and kind of go, what have I done? But it's an excellent book. It's got a great title and it's got an underlying kind of little, you know, spark to it called the federal, overreach. So talk a little bit about what compelled you to write the book and specific to the issue of the federal overreach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I wrote this book and I think why I timed it to come out now is that I have spent a long time thinking about this problem. I've been coalescing a lot of my research and experience, uh, and I've just started to really think that that the nation has reached a critical junction. We're at a critical decision point, and we're experiencing the same patterns over and over again. And it's not often that we start to see momentum from different perspectives around, hey, the time is now for us to really discuss and make some honest decisions around these issues.
Right.
And the pattern I've seen over and over again, and I illustrate in the book, is that we have continuously as a nation pursued a strategy where we react too late, we spend too much, and we continue to rebuild in the same dangerous places over and over again. And at the same time, because it becomes very emotional in that context, we tend to steer away from having that honest conversation that is grounded in research and evidence. And therefore, we tend to take more incremental approaches
Right.
instead of really thinking about how do we leave a better system and how do we produce better outcomes both for the nation and for future generations.
Let me play off of that because I think there's a couple of key points. Um, and we'll talk about, in a sense, how that what we're finding, in no disrespect, this is not, I want to reiterate for myself, and I'm sure for you, this is not a criticism of first responders in the world that, of individuals and leaders and communities and experts that get out there in the middle of these terrible situations to make sure people are safe and recovered and all. But I think what you're pointing out is this has really become inefficient, uneconomical. All right. And let me play off of this. David, are we really redefining risk and responsibility, so to speak, and who owns the risk and where and how we should be not paying ahead, paying for the expectation of what we know are these risks. Like you said, people living in the same places, getting funding to rebuild exactly what they had before. I think what you've taught me and others is that pre-disaster risk mitigation, which has this notion of a 1 to 6 or 1 to 10 or better return on investment, right? So is what we're really talking about a pivot in how the nation looks at risk from these disasters?
I think so. I think one of the things that I tried to hit on in the book is that we're not just dealing with inefficiency. I think that's an easy out to just say, hey, we're going to make some changes because we think we're spending too much and we're spending it in the wrong places.
Right.
I think that what I tried to articulate is that this is really a system that is designed on structural contradiction. And what I mean by that is that FEMA was designed to be a last resort federal partner. But over these decades, and this has been echoed not just by me, by a number of FEMA administrators, is we've really turned it into the first call agency for every storm, fire, or infrastructure failure. And
Right.
that's really never what FEMA was intended to be. And what I also try to articulate is that this didn't happen overnight.
Mhm.
I mean, it has been a result of a series of political incentives, disincentive decisions. It's been a series of public expectation changes, as well as it's been, shifts and adjustments to the federal declaration process that has really driven us to where we are. And as a result, to get back to your question about how are we going to deal with the catastrophes that we're potentially going to face and may face more of, is that the system we have today, in many ways, is not a measure of true catastrophe. It's a measure of funding effectiveness.
So that really is a part of your explanation, if I'm hearing it right, about the federal overreach.
It is, and what I should have probably stated in the book more clearly is that what this means is that our system is really a result of disaster inflation, meaning we're doing more declarations, we're appropriating more federal money, but it's resulting in fewer improvement in local capacity, which we all recognize we need to increase risk management results, reduce our exposure.
Well, and look, you've used the word system several times here. It really is a system. But again, we use the Gordian knot.
Yeah.
You know, you had one great string of, okay, we anticipate that we're going to have disasters as a nation. We're going to prepare ourselves. We're going to respond. We're going to recover. We're going to rebuild. Great, great line. As you said, now there's a lot of different pieces entwined. All right. Let me go to something that you also just said. If it's a systems approach, what's the resolution? You've suggested this resilience reset act, which the word reset is a wonderful way of saying, wait a minute, time out for a moment. Can we really, really take a look at how we're doing things in a much more, I don't know, realistic, less emotional, take some of the politics out. Tell me about that solution that you're presenting, because you don't just say, look, we got a problem. It's overreach. This thing has gotten really knotted up. You've come forward with some ideas. So let's talk about what the resolution is.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just kind of give a little bit of explanation of how I define or how I use the term overreach in the book, and that'll kind of lead us into that discussion around
Perfect.
what are
Perfect.
next steps and what is this resilience reset act um, uh, proposal really mean. And also, if we step back and we look at federal overreach, I define it in a very conservative and probably narrow way of it's really when the federal government takes on more responsibility than it should
Right.
or that it can in managing an issue or a challenge. And in this case, it means that we've positioned FEMA to become the default agency for every disaster. And the result is things that we anticipated, the science community, even the emergency management and disaster management expertise and leaders back in the, when FEMA was being considered suggested, which is how do we do this and how do we involve the federal government in a way that it doesn't disincentivize local and state preparedness?
Right.
So
Right.
the result is that we have evolved a system that extends well beyond FEMA, that has essentially incentivized communities to grow dependent on a distant bureaucracy rather than investing in their own resilience.
Let me,
And
okay, so let's sort of quote unquote unpack part of that, right? Um, when I talk with offices of emergency management, even at the local level, all the way up, back to DC, I kind of refer to it as the cat in the tree syndrome. All right. We've put so much expectation and so much of a burden on emergency management to go up and get the cat out of the tree for us versus where their time and effort and energy could be most uh you know effective, most important, right? So part of it is saying, look, let's get back to what is the core mission. And then I think what you're also saying, or what I'm hearing you say, is that at the boots on the ground level, we need to unleash all of the resources, all the capabilities, including whatever the role of the federal government may be going forward. Am I hearing that right? Is
I
how do
think
we
that's right.
unleash
Yeah.
locals?
Yeah, I think that's where I come back in the book and talk about, really what has underpinned our nation is that we're a federal democracy. And so my book doesn't say we need less federal engagement. It really says we need smarter federal
That's a
engagement.
great point.
And
That's
it
a good point.
and it echoes that from the thread of collaborative federalism, which is really about realigning, rebalancing the relationship between the federal government and state and local authority and tribal and territorial authorities, where the federal government should really step back and lead through catastrophic coordination. And every storm is not a catastrophe from a structural perspective, but it is a catastrophe from an individual
Right.
perspective. And we
Right.
need to understand that. And therefore, state and local governments should reclaim that operational control for most emergencies because they're closest to those that are impacted and affected.
I know we talked about, you know, th this conversation. I want to jump to something and I'm going to come back to some very specific realities of examples that you've seen and, how those set in motion for you are set off some red flags for you for writing the book, but also coming forward with a solution. But David, I think also it is human nature to just want to get back to normal as soon as possible. It's just, I mean, we when we get in an unsettled, uncertain scenario for which disasters create that, we want to respond to getting folks back to where they were before. I think that's a part of the cultural shift. And the reality is, I can't get you back to where you were before. The world's changed. You've lost your store, you've lost your home, your neighborhood has changed, the structures have changed. That's where I think you and others have really been suggesting to me is if we really think this through in a much more purposeful, or to use your phrase, smart way, then racing to just get you back to where you were before, that's just repetitive insanity to me. All right. So cultural means that we really have to have individuals, families, communities make this shift as well in their expectations. So I wanted to kind of put that on as a part of the cultural circumstances that we're dealing with. Am I making sense, David, at all?
No, absolutely. I think those are important points that, we do need a cultural shift. And that cultural shift is partly about resetting our relationship between the states and Washington.
Right,
One of the important points I make in the book is that when you think about rebalancing, you have to think about where that smarter federal contribution can come from.
right,
And that resilience reset at is really about three pillars. It's risk-based funding or financing. It's establishing and federal flexibility, and it's really about state and local empowerment. And what I mean by those three pillars is that in risk-based funding, we need to start allocating federal resources before a disaster, pre-disaster mitigation or adaptation, and it needs to be based on real hazard exposure and vulnerability, not where there are political relationships.
right. David,
Second, oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I
Sorry.
was going to say the second pillar that I emphasize in that Reset Act about federal flexibility is about reducing these rigid program silos and really allowing tailored cross-sector approaches, which gets to your point in future-proofing Americas of really, trying to unleash the diverse resources that are available to help a community become resilient and reduce their risk and exposure. And that could be accomplished through a series of different mechanisms and tools. For example, block grants don't just mean you give the money and say good luck. It
Right,
just means that you're offering more flexibility in the states being able to utilize that money, but you can still put accountability on being able to measure the effectiveness of those funds that were allocated and distributed. And I think the third pillar was really about how do we empower states, tribes, and localities to take the lead,
right,
and all. And how do we make sure that they know that we have their back, particularly when the issues become no longer local or and actually become catastrophic and devastating for the nation.
David, if you were to have what you just described in place, let's go back in history. Katrina, was this very alarming wake-up call. I mean, we all thought Hurricane Andrew, 30, 40 years ago was a wake-up call. Katrina comes along, and in my hometown, Hurricane Harvey comes along. So, it almost is like, I mean, how many more wake-up calls can we have? But let's go back a little bit in time. If what you are describing in Disaster Nation and in this reset, what would it have looked like? What would have Katrina looked like, or some of these other events that you've been a participant in the response?
Well, I think first is that we wouldn't just be building for purpose, we'd be building for the future.
Right,
And that means that we would have assessed the infrastructure, which has become a critical to the economy as well as just society in general across this nation, whether you're a rural or you're an urban community.
right,
And therefore, we would have started to make uh, investments for the future and not just to incrementally improve the performance of today. And I think that's a very important point that I try to make in the book. I think another important point is that I do try and tease out the importance and the criticality of insurance and reinsurance and risk transfer mechanisms and how they could be better tied not just to outcomes, but to financial security, both in terms of governments themselves being financially stable as well as individuals that rely on insurance type tools and resources. I also try to highlight that we can look at insurance as not just a tool for for managing risk, but as a warning system. And that's an important element of the
Go into that a little bit more.
side
That's a really
and
interesting.
the and how new advances in technology like smart sensors, adaptable responsive infrastructure, as well as artificial intelligence can play. And so what I mean is that, and actuarials get this, and insurance experts get this, of it being a warning system, is that, when premiums rise or coverage is denied, it's telling us something about risk.
Right.
When claims are processed, it's telling us something about risk. So you can't just look narrowly at where the federal government invests in disaster declarations or in disaster relief, because there are insured, there are uninsured, there are public costs, and there are private costs.
Yep.
And engaging with the insurance and financing industry can offer us a more complete perspective, which then allows you to look at insurance not just from that narrow lens of it's a risk transfer or financial backstop, but it is a signaling device in terms of how we instrument public policy, how we promote public risk education and literacy campaigns to inform and promote behavioral incentives. We want people to understand, if you choose to live here, if you choose to build here,
Right.
there is risk that you will absorb, and you need to account for that risk. The insurance company, of course, they like to articulate that as the protection gap. For those that aren't into insurance, like some of us, let me explain that protection gap in simple terms is the number of people exposed to disaster risk without insurance coverage or
Right.
without adequate amount of insurance coverage. In this country, that means we have a growing protection gap because we have more and more people foregoing insurance coverage, and we have underinsurance, particularly in high risk areas and low income areas. So insurance has to also account for not just fairness in terms of you're offering products to everywhere and everyone, but it has to account for affordability.
As I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of the minister for infrastructure, and I forgot what his complete title was. But when I was over in the Netherlands and listening to the Dutch explain to me, David, in front of this entire large group of senior executives and officials, he and I had a conversation very similar to this. And he said, Richard, we don't have insurance here in the way that you in the States do. And we don't have lawyers doing what lawyers do in the States. We believe it is a national responsibility to risk mitigate our country and most importantly, our citizens and the economy. And I thought, okay, now some would say, well, that's a socialist kind of approach. But what he was trying to emphasize is that risk is truly a shared responsibility in that you can pay somebody to take on your risk. But if you choose to do certain things that otherwise would not be the appropriate decisions, I'm trying to stay away from a certain word, but I think what you're saying is part of this reset, David, is not just at the governmental level. It is also at the other parts of the institutions and organizations, which
Yeah.
are insurance and mortgage, the individual, right? This is really going to have to be something where there is some form of an alignment once and for all. Am I
Yeah,
saying
you,
it right?
you definitely have to look at it as we need to marshal both public and private capital, right?
Yeah.
And I think your point and analogy to the Netherlands, I'll kind of restate it this way, and I think I hit these points in the book. Maybe not as salient as what we're discussing today. Is that yes? Risk is a shared responsibility, but risk reduction is also a shared investment.
Yes.
And that means
Yes.
that the Netherlands has taken the perspective that no, it's not that they don't have a private or capital insurance market. It's that they've really perceived the issue, and I tried to articulate it this way as we need to transform insurance from just being a set of products and lines of and insurance lines to
Right.
it should be moving from, which means it's really a private contract. It's a contract with an entity
Right.
or an individual.
Right.
So moving and transforming insurance from a private contract into a public resilience tool. That's really what I've tried to articulate in the
Right.
book. And
And
what that means is that to marshal those private and public resources, you have to start to think about how do we offer income scaled premium assistance? How
right.
do we support community based catastrophic insurance to spread risk and lower cost? How do we reform our federal insurance programs so that they're better aligning, the inputs with the outputs, meaning the premiums that they collect with the risks that they're covering, but
Right.
still assure a level of protection and affordability? How do we use reinsurance markets and catastrophic bonds to offer a backstop to federal exposure without relying solely on the taxpayer? This gets to the analogy of if you look at the FDIC and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, we'll the federal government, the U.S. federal government will guarantee you up to 250,000 per account, but anything beyond that, they don't. You
Right.
know, and then how do you pilot and really create and transform the regulatory environment that has an important role in the financial and insurance sector so that it enables more innovation in experimentation and use of new solutions or technologies like parametric insurance, micro insurance, that may challenge traditional models, but could expand coverage and therefore reduce that protection gap.
Listen, I'm pumped that you touched on this because this is kind of a passionate sweet spot of mine. Um, I am a big fan of incentivizing versus regulating. I'm not without the reality that sometimes you have to put certain rules and guardrails in, but I am a bigger fan of incentivizing. I think you just hit kind of the pieces that we need to look at this where, yes, the private sector sells a product, can obviously make a profit accordingly as they should. And at the same time, how we're also trying to reduce the size and scale and scope of loss claims because it is not just on the profit side, it's also on the operational side of these companies. It's on the livelihoods of citizens and all. Let me ask real quick,
Well,
David.
I would, before you ask me, I think that I also would like to just emphasize that, there's a messaging problem here. Those that carry insurance companies are not profiting off of your suffering, they're profiting off of your preparedness. And that
Yes,
and we need to better message that from a public-private perspective because insurance is a key instrument. And I anticipate it could be an even more critical instrument and driver in both expanding financial protection, both for individuals, businesses, and governments, but also in achieving fair resilience. But in part of that cultural reset, we need folks to understand that when you paid in, you were investing in protection.
correct.
You were investing in preparedness. We need incentives that reward you for investing in that preparedness because insurance companies are not in the business of profiting off of suffering.
Right. I think
They
you,
are in the business of profiting off of encouraging and supporting financial and therefore infrastructure or asset protection.
you've heard me say this, when I first started looking at this, oh, so many years ago, kept on thinking about when I call my, car insurance, they ask me three questions after the VIN number, right? They ask me, do you have anti-lock brakes, a rear view camera, and one of these new alert systems? Well, they're not writing the check to my auto dealer, all right? They're basically giving me a discount three times over to pick up the cost of what's going into the car that limits their risk exposure. I'm spending the money, right? At the same time, they're expecting that I'm going to operate that vehicle to the fullest of the extent so that I can go to work, pick up a check, and pay my premium. It's all interrelated, right? And I think that's been where this slow pivot, and hopefully one that will be accelerated by some of the work that we're doing, your book, others, to make that pivot. David, I'm going to do a rapid fire on a couple of questions and then really ask you to pull some, pieces from the book, some of your quotes, some of the reference, and some of the, kind of the key principles that you want to leave people with that would, hopefully get them to buy the book and read it and such. All right. One of the things that you have centered your life going back to your training is around technology and innovation, which we now know, where, I mean, there's a huge amount of data, David, and this is where artificial intelligence may be the positive. There's different things in the way of collecting and curating data, sensors and meters. We have these tools. How do you see them really playing out much more um, significantly as soon as possible and more into your strategy of, responding to the issues of a disaster nation?
Hey, yeah, I don't think we'll move forward in disaster risk reduction or in achieving resilience goals if we don't double, triple, quadruple down on the potential and the opportunity around catalyzing information technology. You
Right,
know, um, you know, that can involve, like I said, the ability to integrate, which is the key word, integrate these innovations and put them into the hands of decision makers and those entities and individuals that matter.
right,
AI and artificial intelligence, satellite systems, we've got a proliferation of those assets. That investment is good for America. It is good for the disaster management industry. It provides insights and analytics and other capacities that we've never had at a level of fidelity that we've never been able to achieve. I think the word of caution I raise is that we need, and I started out my answer this way, is we need more than innovation. We need integration. And that's where public resources can play an important role.
right,
Um, this gets back to a constant theme I hit on, that no matter how much money we invest, no matter how many people we train, if we don't tie that to some way to measure and build capacity on the front lines, they will never be able to effectively adopt these tools and technologies at a pace that is needed to address the risk we're facing and to inform the investments we need to make today to get the future outcomes we want tomorrow.
right,
And to be honest, the federal government isn't really properly structured to do that.
right,
And that was my point of federalism in the book, is that we've been there, we've done these things in other sectors where the federal government has said, hey, we've taken it this far.
yeah,
We think the best thing for us to do is rebalance with the state and locals, because they can become, in the old adage, it was laboratories of democracy. In the
right,
new adage, it's laboratories of innovation and ingenuity
Correct.
because we've incentivized them and given the ability for more creativity. And one of the cautions you have to make is when you centralize, you can close down creativity and opportunity because you've narrowed the pathway to adoption.
Well, and look, it also lets you play off of your phrase integration, the word integration. When I listen to that, and again, you and I have had a lot of conversations about this point, but it's workforce. It's to enable individuals to be able to use these tools, to be trained. Um, it's also a way to engage low to moderate income communities in not only making their neighborhoods and communities go from just surviving now to more importantly thriving, but it's also employment in economic opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So I think
It,
you've
it,
always championed this idea of there's a significant amount of technology, innovation, and ingenuity over here. We have an in use and in case over here. It's how do you integrate it? How do you connect this? And one of the connection points has got to be that we have a workforce opportunity and we have an employment opportunity and we have an economic growth opportunity.
absolutely. And I think one of the things that you'll find in the book is that not only do I try and take you on a journey to understand through research and evidence where we were and where we are and how we've got to where we are today, but then I factor in a series of appendices that then complement perhaps the chapter you should probably read, which is the last one, which starts to really flush out this concept of a resilience reset act that's really grounded in 12 principles. And what I try to do is present that as a framework for national reform, and where I'm focusing on how do we strengthen, expand, and uplift preparedness? How do we empower non-federal entities? And I say non-federal because I don't just talk about the states. I talk about the tribes. I talk about the territories.
Right.
I talk about local governments. How do we ensure fairness across the systems and the apparatus that we choose to transform to? How do we recognize that things are going to happen?
Right.
Disasters will occur. That doesn't mean we just wait to respond and then we recover afterwards. We can transform the way we look at how we mitigate by really building to the future and not for today.
Right.
How do we recognize that we're going to need some financial protection? And that's the insurance reform,
Right.
reinsurance reform discussions with that could include more collaboration and partnering between the private sector, the states, and the federal government, as well as I factor into those principles technological innovation. So it's kind of like a bucket list of what's your bucket list if you had the keys to the kingdom for
Right.
today, what would your bucket list be if you could transform the nation towards resilience? And that really means that those principles, because I factor in things like insurance reform and technological innovation, are not just policy goals.
Right.
They are a contract for accountability that really reframes federal disaster governance around outcomes and not optics, meaning
Right.
we're not racing to show that we're there um, to look good in the media. Every decision we're making is really about producing outcomes that benefit society, the nation, and those that are impacted by these risks.
And
Now,
measurable. And
and measurable.
measurable.
And that gets to the point. I did include some elements to that, right, into the
Right.
Respect Act, where we have to look at risk-based allocations. We have to look at community level resilience benchmarks. those are factored in so that we're not rewarding for past failures. Hey, you get a declaration and that's going to allow you to get an inject so that you can repair and rebuild.
Right.
We're really incentivizing future readiness through that framework of those 12 principles.
David, and again, I want to wrap up on a couple of key points, but where does philanthropy, because you and I have talked about this as well, that, there are kind of three P's here. There's the public, the private, and we know that philanthropy historically has kind of stepped into the gap between those two. Where do you see philanthropy playing out in your solution set?
So I think that it plays out in a key point that I make in those last chapters and in the appendices around this resilience credit score concept,
Right,
where communities get credit for their ability to marshal public, private, philanthropic resources to achieve measurable outcomes.
right,
And that then, compels them, as well as it motivates philanthropists to become more involved, because not only do they feel that they will get something out of their investment, but the will be rewarded for for um, for stepping out of the echo chamber
right,
of safety, which is I want to engage with my peers in emergency management. No, I now am going to be incentivized to engage with my infrastructure and critical utility owners. I'm going to be incentivized to engage with my foundations and around perhaps maybe experimenting on new messaging campaigns or experimenting with the universities on new analytic tools and approaches.
right,
All those could factor into how you now define that resilience credit score, which then informs how resources are allocated. I think there's a couple of takeaways that I would encourage folks that read the book, particularly folks that may be in a decision making role, that I'd like to emphasize. I think first is that, if I was not from Washington, yes, would I be alarmed at the discussions that we're having today? Absolutely. We need to have an honest conversation around resilience and what it means, and recognize that it may mean slightly different things to different places and to different organizations. But that doesn't mean that we can't achieve it. Another point is that the burden and opportunity of resilience, we have to be honest, we have to recognize, must shift out of Washington. Washington cannot micromanage national resilience if you perceive it down to Main Street.
right,
And that means state and local leaders need to understand that they have an opportunity here. They have an opportunity to better target their investments, to reset their preparedness goals, to expand their partnerships, and to really push federal reform that empowers them and not displaces them.
right.
And I think those are important points that they need to understand.
David, a couple of quick questions, and then I want to wrap up. I you are so brilliant, and I really appreciate both your professionalism, your friendship, and mentoring and guiding me through what we've tried to do. I think about we've created this resilience community trust, which is this 501(c)(3) for corporate philanthropy foundations and donor advised funds to come through the trust, obviously get a tax break, but to use those resources to really make, a powerful investment with a return, with a return, into this investing, like you've discussed, at the hyper local level, right? Number one, I think, there's some good opportunities out there to align some examples of, development, so to speak, that are um, the problem is they're onesies and twosies, David. We need to scale some of these things, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah.
The second part that I take away from this conversation and where you're driving with, the book is um, we have a moment in time. We have a moment in time. And yes, there are a lot of different perspectives about where we are right now in that moment in time. But this really is, I think, as you've described it, a framework that hopefully folks will look at that framework and take into account. I know there's some new legislation moving up on the Hill coming out of the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee to look at how the reform of FEMA, but it's not just FEMA, as you pointed out. This is really a whole of government
Yeah.
approach. David, somebody reads this book, sets it down. What would be the one thing that you would want somebody to do? I always describe this when I get back to my office on Monday, whatever day it is that somebody listens to it. I read the book, David. What's the one action you would want somebody to take from that book?
I think the one action is to engage their emergency manager at the local level. I think that there isn't always a tight interaction between political leadership and emergency and disaster managers and risk planners
Right.
until bad happens. And if they could do anything, is to say, take the 12 principles and walk across the hall, walk down the hall, knock on the door of your risk planner or your resilience officer and say, hey, have you seen this? What do you think? Do we have any of these things?
Yep.
I'm concerned.
I think
And
what
that
you,
that really
I,
shifts the and reframes the way we think about disasters, Richard, right? That
right.
shifts us away from oh, are we prepared to plot to submit an application? And do you know how to submit an application for federal response assistance? To
Right.
no, we should really be a partner or co-investor with with our businesses, our philanthropists, with the federal and state government, and really pushes the conversation more towards anticipatory resilience and not response dependence.
David, what I heard you just say is something I've been thinking about. We can either work on this right now during the blue sky days, or we can just focus on the blue tarp days.
Yeah.
Blue tarp is very expensive. It's much more expensive. We both know. So we have a blue sky most of the time to really be much more purposeful about the resources, the economics, the investment. And I think what my takeaway is that you have very specifically taken all of your experience, your knowledge, your observations, and really set in motion, a framework that we would like to incorporate in what we're doing with Future Proofing America, and to be able to define this, whether it's on the standards or the capital side of this. But David, thankfully, you took the time to write this book. You're passionate about the solution set, and I really hope those who listen to this fireside, one, will get the book for sure, and two, will take to heart what David just said. Don't just read it and kind of go either shake your head or, boy, I wish somebody would do something about it. I'm hoping that it becomes, David, not just a part of the dialogue. We've got a lot of dialogue, David. I think what we're really saying is the get stuff done nature of this country really needs to look at the book. So congratulations, David, for doing this, for taking the time, and thank you for spending time sitting down and talking. I know it's remotely. I wish we were sitting together, but congratulations on the book. Any last quick observation or comment?
Just Richard, thank you, and thank you Future Proofing America for inviting me to come in. I enjoy. You can sense I'm passionate about the subject matter. So it was delightful to get an opportunity to share and discuss some of the key points that I make in the book, and the opportunities that lay ahead for us in the resilience community.
We've got to be optimistic, David, and that's what I think you also provide is it's not just a critique of where we are, but there is some optimism to the opportunity here. So thank you.